Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So only 2 days ago, the Japanese Prime Minister was here at Sendai to talk about women as leaders in disaster risk reduction. There are a lot of sessions here for the last 3 days which raised the gender dimension of disaster. But beyond words and statements, what does it mean to really integrate gender equality within disaster risk reduction? My name is Virginie Le Masson. I work for the Overseas Development Institute, a research think tank based in London. And in this presentation, I focus on the two main issues that often prevent people who work in disaster risk reduction to be serious on gender equality. The first issue is actually why does gender equality matters? And the second issue is how do we actually do gender mainstreaming? To address the first issues, it's actually pretty easy. I'm going to give you 3 good reasons. The first one is that women and girls are still predominantly marginalized in decision-making processes across the world and in many societies. You take the G20 in London in 2009, out of 47 ministers of trade and finance, there were only 4 women. And that highlights the pervasive gender gaps among those who hold power and the position to make decisions and to allocate financial resources. A second good reason is that women and girls are still the primary victims of gender-based violence. 1 woman in every 3 women will experience violence, whether it's physical, sexual, or emotional, once in their lifetime. And that's simply not right. And that seriously undermines the resilience of people. A third good reason is that disasters affect both men and women, but in different ways, because everyone is different. But often disaster risk reduction and interventions come up with gender-neutral activities which may not address people's specific needs and realities. So now that we know that gender matters in DRR, how do we actually mainstream gender equality within disaster risk reduction? In this presentation, I suggest 6 practical steps. And I'm going to go through each one of them with concrete examples. The first step is commitment. Commitment to tackle gender inequalities. And this is crucial because without commitment, none of the rest of the steps can follow. This means clearly to recognize gender inequalities, even within disaster risk reduction. So in this workshop, for instance, in 2009, in which I participate, participants to be trained as the Indian Ocean Disaster Response Team, there were approximately 25 participants and only 4 were women. And that influenced the rest of the process. So to commit to tackle gender inequalities means to promote and encourage women to not only participate in DRR, but to actually have an active role, to be leaders and in position of taking decisions. With commitment, then we have a mandate to allocate resources, and these include to build the capacities of staff members, of researchers, of policymakers, to know how to mainstream gender equality within the work that they do. I was in India last month on a workshop on gender equality, and most participants, including women, were really skeptical about this workshop because they felt, what does it have to do with what I'm doing? We work on climate change, we work on disaster risk, we don't really work on gender, and actually, do we actually care? But after 3 days, the same women were saying to us that they totally changed their mind, and they presented us a gender action plan to commit to tackle gender inequalities within their work within the next 3 years. And they felt they were better equipped. So they don't have to be gender experts to act on gender equality. They just need to better understand what it means. And that's the case for everyone. With commitment and better capacities, then we have the means to actually work on mainstreaming gender throughout the cycle project management. And this includes conducting gender analysis or conducting gender-sensitive vulnerability assessments. Often the risk is that field teams may be male-dominated and they might miss out information that is crucial to understand communities' needs and perspectives. if it's only men, for instance, they might not be able to understand what are women's concerns over gender-based violence, because women will never say that they fear about intimate partner violence, for instance. Or women might not disclose information about their concerns about reproductive health or sexual health. So the idea really is to make sure those who work at the grassroots levels can actually reflect on the diversity of perspectives within the communities that they work with. And that includes making sure that people who work in DRR also have female members in their teams. The fourth step is to design projects that mainstream activities that are fair to both men and women's needs. So here I'm using the example of my doctoral thesis that I conducted in India, where I conducted a vulnerability and capacity assessment with a gender perspective and with the help of a male research assistant. So I conducted interviews with women while my male counterpart was conducting interviews with men, and we compared our findings based on participatory activities we were doing. And we found that within the same household, men and women had different perspectives over resources that they own and over challenges that they face. So for instance, when I was interviewing women, one of the primary concerns in this particular region of India, which is called Ladakh, they were saying that water access was one of the primary problems. But when we asked men, none of them really raised this as an issue. And this has to do with their different roles, because women there are the ones who are in charge of irrigating the fields. They are the ones in charge of fetching water to provide drinking water for their family. And so if you don't have this gender perspective when you conduct your activities, then you miss out a whole lot of information that is crucial to make sure that projects are adequate to people's perspective and needs. And more than that, it's not a question just to be fair, it's also a question of supporting people's strategic interest. So for instance, NGOs still in Ladakh decided to implement projects to increase women's economic opportunities. But when you talk to women, they were like, yeah, we're happy to be involved in a self-help group, we're happy to create artifacts and sell them in the market and have a salary, but we actually don't have time to do it because we're already overworked. We already have so much responsibilities which are unpaid, invisible, and unvalued that we don't have time nor the capacities to be involved in productive activities. So to address people's strategic interest and to support their empowerment is to make sure that we acknowledge their own positions and their own values and perspectives and create this space where both men and women can share their interest. The sixth and final step is to monitor and evaluate the outcome of project with gender lens. Here I'm using the example of a project we conducted in parallel with an NGO in Central African Republic. And in this example, the objective was not only to make sure that village committee working on water access, for example, would include one woman, as often is the case. It's not just because they have one woman in the community that they have mainstream gender equality. The point was to find out within the community whether women felt that they could participate in the decision-making processes. And sometimes when you want to find this out, you need to separate different gender groups. But sometimes in other settings, this is different, and you actually bring people together so that both groups can understand what are the perspectives of the other group. And this process sometimes is actually facilitated by people who come from the outside rather than people from the inside. But this really depends on the context. So to summarize, these are the 6 steps that I hope they could support the work of people who work on disaster risk reduction. And to remind them is, the point is to commit to tackle gender inequalities, to commit so that we can allocate resources to build people's capacities, to be better equipped to use mainstream gender equality. The third step was to conduct gender analysis through gender-sensitive assessments. The fourth step was to design activities that are fair to both men and women's needs. Fifth was to support empowerment as opposed to empower people, because people empower themselves. And the sixth step is to monitor and evaluate with a gender lens the outcomes of any project. Ultimately, this is to support resilience because it reflects the diversity of societies to make sure resilience is equal and fair to all. Thank you very much.